Chapter 8. Changing Perfectionistic Behaviors. Why change perfectionistic behaviors? Perhaps the most effective method of overcoming perfectionism is to change the behaviors that help to keep your perfectionistic beliefs, attitudes, and predictions alive. If you have a tendency to set very high standards for yourself or others, you probably use some of the behaviors discussed in Chapter 4, either to ensure that your standards are met or to avoid situations that force you to confront your high standards. Examples of perfectionistic behaviors include overcompensating by doing much more than is necessary to deal with a situation, unnecessary checking and reassurance seeking, repeating behaviors, excessive organizing and list-making, procrastination, failure to delegate tasks to others, and avoidance of anxiety-provoking situations. Behaviors associated with perfectionism help to maintain the problem. By engaging in these behaviors, you prevent yourself from testing out and disproving your perfectionistic thoughts. In other words, continuing to behave like a perfectionist makes it difficult to stop thinking like a perfectionist. For example, if you believe that only by checking and rechecking your work can you maintain your high standards, the act of repeatedly checking your work will prevent you from ever finding out whether that belief is true. Similarly, procrastinating on a project because you are worried about not being able to do an adequate job prevents you from ever finding out whether that prediction is true. In fact, procrastination often makes it more difficult to perform well because, in the end, you have less time and you are under more pressure. Therefore, procrastination can end up confirming your anxiety-provoking beliefs about not being able to do a job well. In small amounts, the behaviors we are describing as perfectionistic can be helpful. For example, proofreading an important report once or twice is likely to improve the quality of your work. Putting off an unpleasant task for a short time may give you the necessary break you need to tackle the job later. On the other hand, overdoing these behaviors is likely to cause problems. For example, excessive checking gives you less time to do other things and may even increase your anxiety. Correcting other people too often may lead them to feel inadequate or angry with you for not trusting them. Including too much detail in your conversations with other people can lead the other person to become bored and to start daydreaming, therefore missing much of what you are trying to say. Changing the behavior patterns that are associated with your perfectionism is a key step toward overcoming the problem. The strategies described in this chapter are especially important for people who have difficulty identifying or changing specific thoughts using the cognitive strategies discussed in Chapter 7. The techniques in Chapter 7 involve trying to change thoughts by examining the evidence for and against them, and by trying to replace negative thinking patterns with more realistic beliefs. In contrast, the behavioral strategies discussed in this chapter change beliefs directly by providing new learning experiences that disprove the thoughts. Therefore, changing perfectionistic behaviors leads to automatic changes in perfectionistic thoughts. Strategies for changing perfectionistic behaviors. In this section, we discuss a range of strategies that are effective for changing your perfectionistic behaviors. We'll begin with exposure, which involves directly confronting the situations that make you uncomfortable. Exposure-based strategies. For the past few decades, therapies based on exposure have been used to treat anxiety problems such as social anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder, and, to some extent, other problems such as depression and eating disorders. Basically, exposure involves confronting a feared object or situation over and over again until the fear decreases. For people who fear driving, we encourage them to practice driving initially in safe settings until the discomfort subsides. For people who fear heights, we have them encounter increasingly high places until they no longer experience significant fear. Exposure is the best strategy to use for dealing with situations that trigger intense negative reactions, such as fear or anger. Similarly, exposure can be especially helpful for people who avoid situations because of their perfectionism. Exposure is a very powerful strategy for dealing with unrealistic fears. In the case of certain phobias, such as animal phobias, most individuals are able to overcome their fear in a matter of hours. For other fears, changes often take longer, but still a considerable percentage of people benefit from exposure-based treatments. In our experience, exposure is also very useful for dealing with perfectionism, which is often associated with a fear of being imperfect or failing to meet some goal or standard. In dealing with perfectionism, exposure involves purposely allowing oneself to repeatedly encounter imperfect situations that cause anxiety, frustration, or discomfort until they are no longer a problem. The effects of exposure on fear and anxiety are universal. Even animals appear to become less anxious after repeated exposure to a frightening situation. For example, a new puppy may be fearful of strangers or of walking near busy streets. With repeated exposure, however, these situations become easier. In our experience, even spiders respond to exposure. When we work with people who are phobic of spiders, we encourage them to confront spiders by being near them and eventually touching them. Not only do our clients become less fearful of the spiders, but the spiders seem to become less fearful of our clients. By the end of the treatment session, the spider is much less likely to run away compared to the beginning of the session. In order to use exposure as a treatment for perfectionism, you must first identify situations that make you uncomfortable and then create exposure practices to target those particular situations. Later in this chapter, we describe exactly how to conduct exposure practices for particular situations that may occur. Why exposure works. Exposure is based on the premise that people can get used to almost anything if they are given enough time. For example, people who go camping in the wilderness, as well as contestants on the TV show Survivor, get used to being dirty if they don't have access to running water for a shower or bath. During war, people may even get used to the sound of bombs going off in nearby neighborhoods. There are several different explanations for why exposure works. One of the most compelling theories is based on a cognitive model. From a cognitive view, exposure works by changing a person's beliefs about the feared situation. In other words, after repeated experiences in the feared situation, the person gradually learns that nothing bad is going to happen and eventually comes to see the situation as non-threatening and safe. In the case of perfectionism, exposure works in part by teaching a person that even if mistakes are made, the consequences are usually not terrible. Even if your performance is not to someone else's liking, the situation is likely to be manageable. The same rule applies when someone else's behavior doesn't meet your high standards. It's bound to happen, and when it does, it's unlikely to be the end of the world. Exposure to situations where your standards are unlikely to be met is an excellent way to learn that these situations need not be threatening, or that you may benefit from adjusting your standards. Types of exposure. There are different ways in which exposure can be implemented. For example, exposure can be conducted live, also called in vivo exposure, or in the imagination. Although we recommend live exposure whenever possible, exposure in imagination may be appropriate in cases where live exposure is impractical, impossible, or too frightening. For example, if you tend to be very frightened of making mistakes during presentations, we recommend first that you try live exposure by giving presentations and even making minor mistakes that are unlikely to cause any real harm. For example, purposely pausing for a few moments, as if you've lost your train of thought. However, if the thought of giving a real presentation is too overwhelming, you could start by imagining that you are giving a presentation, and work up to the real thing. A second way in which exposure practices can vary is in terms of how gradually steps are taken. We don't recommend that you start by practicing in the most upsetting situation that you can imagine. Rather, we recommend that you start with easier situations and gradually work up to more difficult situations. The rate at which you take steps toward more and more difficult situations is up to you. The faster you take steps, the quicker you will learn to tolerate more difficult situations. However, taking steps more quickly may also lead to more intense discomfort during the practices. How to conduct exposure. You may be thinking to yourself, I'm already exposed to the situation that I fear from time to time, but it doesn't seem to help. In fact, you may have even had experiences when your fear became worse after exposure to a situation you fear. For exposure to be effective, it has to be done in a particular way. In everyday life, exposure to feared situations tends to be unpredictable, brief, and infrequent. For example, when individuals with a spider phobia encounter a spider, it is usually a surprise, unpredictable exposure. In addition, they usually leave the situation quickly, brief exposure, and make sure it doesn't happen again, infrequent exposure. Also, people who are anxious or uncomfortable in a particular situation tends to use subtle ways of avoiding the full impact of the situation, such as distraction, excessive checking, or other overprotective behaviors, so they don't really benefit from the exposure. To maximize the benefits of exposure practices, there are several steps you can take. First, in preparing to conduct exposure practices, develop an exposure hierarchy. An exposure hierarchy is a list of anxiety-provoking situations that are ranked in terms of difficulty. This list can be used to help guide your practices. The items in the hierarchy should be as specific as possible and should include items that are practical and easy to set up when you are ready. In other words, you should not choose items that would be impossible to try even if you wanted to. Following are some examples of exposure practices that can be conducted to change particular types of perfectionistic concerns. Examples of exposure practices. Perfectionistic concern. I cannot handle my house being a mess. Sample exposure practice. Leave particular areas in the house messy. Perfectionistic concern. I spend hours trying to get my hair perfect. Sample exposure practice. Spend no more than 5 minutes on my hair. Perfectionistic concern. I feel compelled to correct my wife when she mispronounces words. Sample exposure practice. Ask my wife to purposely mispronounce words in a way that happens to bother me. Perfectionistic concern. It would be terrible to have someone else notice my hands shaking. Sample exposure practice. Carry a glass of water and let my hands shake. Perfectionistic concern. There is only one right way to fold socks. Sample exposure practice. Fold socks in various wrong ways. Perfectionistic concern. I must never eat any high-calorie foods or I will get fat. Sample exposure practice. Eat dessert from time to time. Perfectionistic concern. I avoid asking my secretary to do my typing because I am very particular about the way I like it done. Sample exposure practice. Ask my secretary to type my letters. Once you have identified specific exercises that may help to challenge your high standards, the next step is to develop your exposure hierarchy. First, generate a list of 10 to 20 exposure exercises. They should include items that range in difficulty from mildly difficult to extremely difficult. Next, estimate, using a scale from 0 to 100, how uncomfortable you will be conducting each practice. The final step is to rank the items in the hierarchy from hardest to easiest. After developing your exposure hierarchy, you will be ready to start your exposure practices. Start with easier items and work your way up to those that are more difficult. As you go along, you will find that some items become easy, and you may want to delete those from the hierarchy. Some steps may be too difficult, in which case you can add some in-between steps to make the process more gradual. It is okay to skip steps as you go along. The quicker you take steps, the quicker the situations will become easier. On the other hand, quicker steps will likely lead to more discomfort during your practices. Choose a pace that provides a balance between exercises that are manageable but also challenging. If you have several different areas of perfectionism, you can develop separate exposure hierarchies for each area. For example, if you have very high standards with respect to cleanliness and schoolwork, you can develop a hierarchy of situations for each of these areas. Or, if you prefer, you may combine them into one hierarchy and work on them together. Deciding between these two approaches is a matter of preference. However, you should keep in mind that trying to do too many things at once may compromise your success. Here is a sample hierarchy for someone with social anxiety who is afraid of making mistakes in front of other people. Sample exposure hierarchy. Fear of making mistakes in front of others. Item. Give a formal presentation about unfamiliar material in front of people who I don't know well, for instance, at work. Fear, from 0 to 100, 99. Throw a party for people from work and prepare a difficult dish that I have never made before. Fear, 85. Purposely forget my wallet when in line at the supermarket. Fear, 85. Ask someone to repeat themselves at my weekly staff meeting. Fear, 75. Show up for an appointment, like a haircut, on the wrong day. Fear, 60. Have lunch with a coworker and allow uncomfortable silences. Fear, 50. Answer a question in my night school class. Fear, 45. Forget my ticket when I pick up my dry cleaning. Fear, 40. Exercise 8.1. Developing your own exposure hierarchy. In your journal, make a list of items that you might include in your exposure hierarchy. Next, rate your fear level for each item using a scale ranging from 0, no fear or anxiety, to 100, maximum fear or anxiety. Finally, rewrite your list in order of difficulty, with the most difficult items at the top and the easier items at the bottom. Use the sample hierarchy as a guide to help you develop your own list. Design practices that are predictable, structured, and planned in advance. Exposure works best when it is predictable and under your control. Whenever possible, plan your practices carefully and ensure that they have predictable outcomes. For example, if you are working on becoming less perfectionistic about your physical appearance, decide in advance how you will practice breaking your standards for appearance. For example, spending less time on your hair, wearing clothes that don't match, and so on. Ensuring the practices are predictable is most important when you first begin to practice. Later, you can purposely build more unpredictable practices into your program. For many practices, you can't possibly know the outcome. For example, if you decide to practice arriving a few minutes late for appointments, to compensate for your belief that you always need to be early for everything, you may not be able to predict what will happen. Some people may not care, whereas others may be annoyed at having to wait for you. To deal with this situation, you can imagine several possible outcomes and think about how you can deal with them if they occur. Of course, you don't want to choose practices that are likely to get you into big trouble, like not showing up for work at all or completely missing a final exam. If you're not sure whether a practice is appropriate and safe, ask a few people whom you trust for their opinion. Continue the practice long enough to learn the situation is safe. The goal of exposure is to learn that you can be in a situation and eventually feel comfortable. Exposure works best when the practice is prolonged. So, if you are nervous about being around people you don't know because you may say something stupid, try spending an extended period with someone who makes you anxious, perhaps having a long lunch, until your anxiety decreases or until you learn that you can manage the situation. If you are uncomfortable leaving a mess in your house, try leaving things messy until you get used to it. Although prolonged exposure works best, some exposures are necessarily brief, things like asking a question in a meeting. In other situations, you may feel too overwhelmed to stay in the situation until the fear decreases. That's okay. However, the best way to compensate for brief exposures is to repeat them often. If you absolutely must stop an exposure practice early, the best thing you can do is to repeat the practice as soon as possible. Practice frequently and schedule your practices close together. Exposure works best if the practices are spaced closely together. For example, if you are afraid of speaking in front of groups because you may make a mistake, giving presentations once a year will probably never lead to a reduction in your fear. On the other hand, if you practice giving presentations for 5 or 10 days in a row, you will notice a substantial reduction in fear over the course of the practices. Weekly practice works better than practicing once a month. Daily practice works better than once a week. We recommend that you try to practice at least 4 or 5 days a week for an extended period each time. Or, if the situation is one that comes up even more frequently, try to practice whenever you have the opportunity. Expect to feel uncomfortable. Don't measure the success of an exposure practice by whether you feel uncomfortable. Rather, a successful exposure practice is one that you complete, regardless of how you feel. If you choose an appropriately difficult situation, you should feel anxious. That's why you are doing the exposure practices in the first place. If you feel anxious during an exposure practice, it's a sign that you need to continue practicing rather than an indication that things are not going well. If you don't feel uncomfortable during a practice, we recommend that you choose a more difficult practice next time. With repeated practices, your discomfort will decrease. However, that doesn't mean that there will be a decrease in discomfort each time you practice. In fact, some practices may be more difficult than previous ones. This may be because it is a more difficult situation, or because you are feeling less prepared, more tired, less confident, more stressed out, and so on. For every few steps forward, there may be a step back. Also, it's possible that on days when you practice exposure, your overall level of stress will be higher. You may even be more irritable with people who are close to you. As your anxiety decreases, other stress-related feelings such as irritability will decrease as well. Don't use subtle avoidance strategies. Subtle avoidance strategies are techniques that you may use to make encountering an anxiety-provoking situation more bearable. These may include distraction, reassurance-seeking, checking, and other tricks for managing the discomfort. These techniques may help you to manage your discomfort in the short term. However, like more obvious forms of avoidance, they prevent you from learning that your perfectionistic thoughts are exaggerated or untrue. In addition, subtle avoidance techniques can undo the effects of your exposure practices. Therefore, try not to use these techniques if at all possible. Use cognitive strategies to cope with discomfort during practices. What you tell yourself or how you interpret the situation can have a big impact on your experience during an exposure practice. Therefore, it will be helpful to use some of the cognitive strategies discussed in Chapter 7 to deal with negative thoughts that occur during exposure practices. For example, you may decide to use the process of hypothesis testing as a way of dealing with negative predictions. Using this method, you can treat your exposure practices like small experiments designed to test the validity of your perfectionistic thoughts. Before an exposure practice, identify any negative predictions that you are making. Then, after your exposure practice, take note of whether your feared outcome actually occurred. By treating each exposure practice as an experiment to test out your hypotheses about what might happen, you will learn that many of your feared outcomes don't come true. There are a few other specific strategies that can be helpful for dealing with anxiety or discomfort experienced during your exposure practices. If you are purposely entering situations where you fear that you may behave imperfectly or incorrectly, make a decision to allow yourself to be imperfect. Ask yourself the question, can I handle imperfection in this situation? Also, remember that the anxiety is temporary and will gradually decrease. In most cases, the worst thing that will happen during an exposure practice is that you will feel uncomfortable. Exercise 8.2. Keeping track of your exposure practices. In your journal, keep track of your exposure practices. For each practice, record 1. The date and time of the practice, 2. A description of the practice, including the specific exercise, the duration of the exercise, and other relevant details, 3. Your average discomfort level during the practice, using a scale from 0 to 100, and 4. How you challenged any negative thinking that arose during the practice. You should notice a decrease in your discomfort levels as you continue to practice exposure. Response prevention. A second strategy for changing perfectionistic behaviors is response prevention. Response prevention involves stopping yourself from engaging in problematic perfectionistic behaviors. This strategy is related to exposure, in that it provides an opportunity to test out the accuracy of your negative predictions. In fact, it should be used along with exposure. The main difference is that exposure involves doing something anxiety-provoking, such as giving a presentation, and response prevention involves preventing the behaviors that you use to protect yourself from feeling uncomfortable or to prevent bad things from happening. For instance, memorizing your presentation beforehand to ensure you don't make any mistakes. By preventing these safety behaviors, you will learn that many of these actions serve no real function other than to decrease your anxiety or discomfort for a short time. For example, if you tend to check your work over and over, preventing the rechecking will teach you that if you stop checking excessively, the quality of your work doesn't suffer as much as you expect it to. Other perfectionistic behaviors for which response prevention can be helpful include correcting or checking the behavior of other people, looking at your watch or clock often to make sure that you are on time, checking your weight or physical appearance, arguing with teachers or professors to have a point or two added to your course grade, excessively washing or cleaning, or participating in any other repetitive behavior that you use to make sure that your standards are met or to reduce your anxiety about not meeting your standards. It is important to do what you can to prevent these behaviors. At first, you may find that your anxiety or discomfort increases significantly when you prevent the behaviors. You may worry about the consequences of not checking, cleaning, or correcting. However, after a while, the discomfort will probably decrease as you learn that nothing terrible happens when you start to eliminate these behaviors. The behaviors associated with your perfectionism may be so ingrained and habitual that you are not even aware of them. There are a number of ways to increase your awareness of these behaviors. First, you can record in your journal times when you engage in behaviors such as checking, repeating, correcting, cleaning, counting, or asking for reassurance. Pay special attention to the specific situations, moods, and places that trigger these behaviors, as well as the way you feel after you engage in the behaviors. This exercise should make you more aware of the perfectionistic behaviors that need to be stopped. If you still have trouble identifying these behaviors, ask someone who is close to you to help point them out. With practice, you should eventually become more aware of your perfectionistic rituals. Communication training. A third strategy for changing perfectionistic behaviors is communication training. Communication training is useful when perfectionism affects the way you communicate with other people. For example, Perfectionism causes some people to communicate in a disapproving or judgmental way with others who do not meet certain perfectionistic standards. If this is a problem for you, it may be important to examine how you communicate your high expectations to other people in your life. Often, perfectionism is associated with an intense drive to change the behavior of other people so it conforms to your high standards. This drive may cause you to constantly nag, correct, or even offend other people with the message that their behavior is not good enough. This message can cause them to feel angry or hurt. For individuals who are more self-focused in their perfectionism, communication may be affected by a tendency to communicate passively and to have difficulty listening to what other people are saying. A full discussion of how to change communication patterns is beyond the scope of this book. There are, however, a few general guidelines that we can provide you, based in part on recommendations from McKay, Davis, and Fanning's book, Messages, the Communication Skills Book, 2009. Be assertive. Everyone encounters situations in which the behavior of other people is inconsistent with their own expectations. However, perfectionism can lead people to communicate their disapproval in a way that is not terribly helpful. By understanding how you communicate and by working on your communication skills, you can lessen the risk of alienating others. There are 3 general styles of communication. The first style, known as passive communication, involves communicating indirectly and putting the needs and rights of others ahead of your own needs. For example, rather than expressing disagreement about a particular topic, a person who communicates passively may be more likely than others to pretend to agree in order to avoid being criticized. Similarly, a passive communicator may find indirect ways to express his or her needs and desires. Some perfectionists, particularly people who tend to feel depressed or socially anxious, may constantly feel that they are not living up to their own standards. They may be at risk for using passive communication if they believe that other people will find what they have to say to be uninteresting or unimportant. Passive communication is usually not an effective form of communicating. Other people are unlikely to hear your message if it is communicated passively. A second style of communication is known as aggressive communication. Aggressive communication puts your own needs ahead of the needs of other people and may involve putting pressure on other people to do things your way. It may be associated with being hurtful or insulting to those around you, and usually leads to the other person shutting down and not listening to you or becoming very angry with you. People who have perfectionistic beliefs about how other people should behave may become quite pushy and aggressive in their attempts to have other people conform to their excessively high expectations. The third and most effective style of communication is called assertive communication. Being assertive involves taking into account both your own rights and needs, as well as the rights and needs of the other individual. Assertive communication involves 3 main components: describing the situation in the most objective, non-biased, and non-judgmental way possible, describing how the situation affects the way you feel, the emotion that you are experiencing, and describing how you would like the situation to change. Although assertive communication is not guaranteed to work, it tends to be more effective than passive and aggressive communication styles. Following are illustrations of how each of the 3 communication styles might be used to tell a child that his or her bedroom needs to be cleaned. Passive. Look into the room, let out a sigh, and roll your eyes. Aggressive. Say to the child, "You are a complete slob. You are never going to amount to anything unless you can learn to be more organized." Assertive. Say to the child, "Your toys are all over your floor. I feel frustrated when I have to clean your room. I would like you to clean your room before you go out today, please." Unlike passive communication, assertive communication is likely to be heard and understood by the other individual. Unlike aggressive communication, Assertive communication is less likely to lead the other person to automatically disagree or feel hurt. Listen. An important part of any communication is listening to the other person. Listening involves hearing what the other person has to say and making a genuine attempt to understand his or her point of view. Perfectionism can get in the way of listening. If you are overly critical of the other person, you may tend to focus your attention on mistakes the other person makes rather than on the entire communication. If you are overly critical of yourself, you may miss important aspects of the other person's communication if you are paying too much attention to how you are coming across or are thinking about what you are going to say next while the other person is talking. A helpful way of making sure that you have heard and understood what the other person has said is to repeat back to the person what you have heard and to ask for clarification if there is a misunderstanding. However, moderation is the key. If you happen to be a person who compulsively asks for reassurance and checks excessively to make sure you understand other people, we recommend that you cut back rather than increase this behavior. Pay attention to nonverbal communication. The words people say are only a small part of their communication. Nonverbal communication plays an enormous role in how others interpret what you say. Nonverbal communication includes such things as voice quality, things like tone, volume, inflection, rate of speech, facial expressions, and body posture. Even if your words are not critical of the people around you, your perfectionism may lead you to communicate your disapproval in nonverbal ways, frowning, crossing your arms, leaning back, and so on. If you can be aware of your nonverbal communication patterns, you can also take steps to ensure that you are not inflicting your perfectionistic standards on others in nonverbal ways. Prioritizing. Do you have difficulty getting things done on time? Or do you spend so much time trying to get everything done that you sacrifice other important areas in your life? A fourth strategy for changing perfectionistic behaviors involves prioritizing. Prioritizing is important for individuals who always feel like they have to get everything done right away. It may also be helpful for people who have problems deciding what to do first, in case they make a wrong decision. The process of prioritizing involves 3 steps. The first step involves generating lists of tasks that need to be completed. Ideally, this should be done on paper, for example, in your journal. You may include separate lists for things that need to be done today, take out the garbage, finish a report, get a haircut, and so on, and things that need to be done sometime, but not right away. Invite neighbors over for dinner, buy a new lamp, get a new passport, take up tennis, and so on. The second step involves examining the list or lists and ranking the items in terms of importance. Just because it feels important that you finish a task doesn't mean that it is important. To assess the importance of the tasks, you need to assess the possible consequences of not completing an item. When you ask the question, "What will happen if I don't finish the task?" you will come to realize that many of the items are not as important as they seemed. The third step is to begin completing the tasks in order of importance and urgency. You should try to be realistic about what can be done and about the possible consequences of not completing certain tasks. If you have problems deciding which task to do first, it may be because it doesn't matter which one you do first. If that is the case, pick one task, flip a coin, and start with it. Overcoming procrastination. The final strategy for changing perfectionistic behaviors is geared toward overcoming procrastination. People procrastinate for a variety of reasons, including not enjoying the particular task or job, not having time to work on the task, being fearful of not being able to complete the task well, and not knowing where to start. In the case of perfectionism, the last 2 reasons are particularly relevant. If you tend to procrastinate, Some of the strategies that we have discussed already, for example, prioritizing, exposure, may be helpful. We recommend that you break up the task into smaller, more manageable pieces. Rather than thinking about how overwhelming the entire job is, try dividing it into smaller tasks that are easily completed. This strategy was essential in helping us write the first edition of this book. Here is a description of how we managed to divide the task of writing a book on perfectionism into smaller, manageable tasks. Steps for writing this book. 1. Develop a table of contents. 2. Develop a list of main headings for Chapter 1. 3. For each main heading, generate a list of subheadings for each topic. 4. Write a first draft of the information that belongs under the first subheading. 5. Repeat Step 4 for each subheading in Chapter 1. 6. Proofread and make revisions to Chapter 1. 7. Repeat Steps 2 through 6 for each of the other chapters. You can use this same strategy for any task. For example, if you are procrastinating about writing a letter, you can break the task into small jobs, such as getting out the paper, addressing the envelope, developing a brief outline, writing the first paragraph, and so on. Each step in isolation is unlikely to be overwhelming. If you come across a particular step that is overwhelming, break it down into even smaller steps. Chapter 9. Accepting Imperfection. The Costs of Control. Napoleon Hill, the American author of the best-selling book Think and Grow Rich, was quoted as saying, "Self-discipline begins with the mastery of your thoughts. If you don't control what you think, you can't control what you do." In The Picture of Dorian Gray, Irish playwright and author Oscar Wilde had a similar view. "I don't want to be at the mercy of my emotions. I want to use them, to enjoy them, and to dominate them." Is it, in fact, true that we need to be in control of our thoughts and emotions? Well, it's certainly true that extreme thoughts and emotions can make life difficult. But is fighting to control your thoughts and feelings the answer? In some ways, perfectionism reflects an extreme need for control. Perfectionists often strive to control the emotions, thoughts, behaviors, performances, and appearance of themselves and others. However, it's impossible to have control over all aspects of your life. Furthermore, your attempts to have complete control either haven't worked or have come with an unreasonably high cost, for example, impaired relationships, which is why you are listening to this book. Sometimes, it is not until we give up our attempts to control our experiences that we actually start to feel more in control. That is not to say that all attempts to control your behavior or experiences are a problem. Control-oriented strategies are useful when used in moderation. For example, saying no to that fourth piece of cake, going to bed at a reasonable hour when you have to be up early the next day, or taking time to study the week before a big exam, are all examples of control-oriented strategies that are potentially helpful. However, there comes a point at which attempts to control your thoughts and feelings begin to make things worse. Efforts to control experiences are a problem when they are extreme, intense, overly rigid, or ineffective. If you are constantly trying to control your own thoughts and feelings, as well as the behavior of others, and your attempts are not working, don't take it as a sign to simply try harder. Rather, it may be a sign that it's time to give up some of your efforts at having complete control over your experiences. Many of the problematic perfectionistic behaviors discussed in Chapter 4 are really just attempts to increase control over your emotions. Examples of these control-oriented behaviors, and a couple of others, include avoiding feared people, situations, places, activities, thoughts, and emotions, escaping from feared situations, overcompensating, checking and reassurance seeking, repeating and correcting, excessive organizing and list making, putting off decisions, distracting yourself from uncomfortable feelings. Take a look through Chapter 4 again if you need a reminder of what these behaviors refer to. Though these strategies help to reduce discomfort in the short term, they also maintain your discomfort in the long term. As long as you continue to use the same strategies that you always use, you will continue to have the same results: anxiety, discomfort, depression, anger, and any other feelings that go along with your perfectionism. We reviewed many of the strategies for reducing these control-oriented behaviors in earlier chapters. In Chapter 7, you learned to observe your thoughts from a distance and to view them as just thoughts, rather than facts. You also learned to challenge your thoughts and to consider alternative ways of viewing things. While, on the surface, this process may seem like attempts to control your thoughts, the cognitive strategies in Chapter 7 are actually designed to help you think more flexibly and to consider a wide range of possible interpretations. Many of these strategies are designed to help you accept negative outcomes, rather than assuming they would be unmanageable. Similarly, in Chapter 8, you learned strategies for reducing control-oriented behaviors. Rather than avoiding situations that make you feel uncomfortable, we encouraged you to confront situations that make you feel uncomfortable, including purposely doing things imperfectly. In the remainder of this chapter, we discuss some additional strategies that are helpful for fostering an attitude of acceptance as opposed to control. These approaches are not really alternatives to the strategies discussed earlier in the book. Rather, they should be thought of as complementary techniques to use alongside the others. In addition, space does not allow for a full consideration of these strategies. Indeed, entire books have been written on these approaches. Rather, we provide you with an overview and suggest that you do further reading if you want to learn more about these approaches. New acceptance-based treatments. In recent years, a number of new treatments have been developed that teach people to accept their negative feelings and experiences rather than trying to change them. For example, psychologist Jon Kabat-Zinn has promoted the use of a meditation-based treatment called mindfulness-based stress reduction for dealing with chronic pain, stress, anxiety, and other negative experiences. This treatment involves learning to be aware of your thoughts and feelings, rather than constantly trying to change them or distract yourself from them. Instead of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, people are encouraged to focus on their present experience, or the here and now. A related treatment approach is Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, ACT, a treatment developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes and his colleagues Kirk Strassel and Kelly Wilson. In this treatment, people are taught to accept their thoughts, feelings, and other experiences, and to make a commitment to changing behaviors so that they are acting in ways that are consistent with what matters most to them. In this chapter, we provide an overview of mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches, including mindfulness-based stress reduction and ACT. Mindfulness-based treatments and ACT have been adapted for use with a wide range of problems associated with perfectionism, including eating disorders, anxiety problems, depression, and anger. In addition, although the research on these treatments is relatively new, preliminary studies suggest that these approaches are useful for preventing relapse in depression, for reducing anxiety, and for improving various other problems. Mindfulness. You may assume that meditation and other mindfulness-based strategies are necessarily weird, New Age, spiritual, or religious in nature. In fact, mindfulness is not necessarily about spirituality or about getting in touch with a higher power, and there is nothing weird or strange about it. Rather, mindfulness is simply a specific kind of attending. Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Bishop and others recently proposed a similar definition in which two components were highlighted. One, awareness of one's immediate experience in the present moment, and 2, allowing one's attention to be accepting, non-judging, and compassionate. Although mindfulness meditation can be traced back 2,500 years to the earliest forms of Buddhist philosophy, it has recently been adapted for use in mainstream modern life. There is nothing about mindfulness that requires people to give up or change their spiritual beliefs, values, or anything else. However, mindfulness may help people to reduce stress and manage negative feelings of anxiety and depression that are often associated with perfectionism. Mindfulness is difficult to describe in a single chapter, let alone a brief section of a chapter like this. If you are interested in additional general information about this approach, the books cited earlier by Kabat-Zinn are a good place to start. Kabat-Zinn has also produced several excellent audio CD programs to guide you through mindfulness practices. mindfulnesscds.com. Finally, you may be able to access mindfulness classes near where you live. Some of these classes may have a more spiritual focus than others, so you may want to shop around until you find a class that is comfortable for you. Becoming more mindful. As we go through our day, most of us spend much of our time on automatic pilot, doing things in an almost mechanical way, and not really taking the time to experience fully what we are doing. For example, when you eat dinner, you may worry about all the work that you need to do after dinner, or daydream about a future vacation, rather than allowing yourself to experience your food. At the same time, many of our experiences are associated with evaluation and judgment. Pay attention to your normal stream of consciousness, and you will find that you are continually evaluating and judging yourself, other people, and your experiences. For example, you may think you are too fat or too thin, or that the room is too hot or too cold, or that the movie you are watching is exciting or boring. Many of the perfectionistic beliefs that you identified in Chapter 3 are also examples of evaluative or judgmental thoughts. On the one hand, it is completely normal to judge and evaluate your experiences. On the other hand, excessive judging and evaluating can feed your perfectionism and lead to high levels of anxiety, depression, and anger. Normally, we go through life without paying much attention to our most basic experiences and activities, including eating, breathing, and moving. Mindfulness practices are designed to help people to be more aware of their experiences. There are many different exercises that can help to facilitate mindfulness. All of these exercises are designed to help us to slow down, focus our attention, and experience life in a non-judgmental, accepting, and non-striving way. The term non-judging refers to experience without evaluating. For example, if you start to feel anxious during practice and notice yourself thinking, "I shouldn't be feeling nervous right now. I need to fight this feeling," try to shift toward a less judgmental stance. For example, "I am feeling nervous right now. I will simply let myself feel whatever I am feeling." Acceptance refers to letting whatever happens happen. Nothing specific needs to happen during a mindfulness session. You're not supposed to think any specific thoughts, and you aren't supposed to feel any specific feelings. As with the cognitive strategies described in Chapter 7, the process of mindfulness encourages you to view your thoughts as just thoughts, rather than facts. If you notice a negative thought, accept it as just a thought and let it go. The same thing applies with uncomfortable feelings. Notice them and accept them for what they are. Non-striving during mindfulness practices means that you should not be trying to achieve anything in particular, not even a state of mindfulness. If you say to yourself, "I must reach a state of mindfulness during this practice," it will undermine the whole process. If you notice your attention wandering, simply be aware of your experiences and gently bring your focus back to the exercise. However, the more preoccupied you are with the need to be mindful, the less mindful you will actually become. Here are brief descriptions for 3 different mindfulness exercises. All 3 of these examples are described in more detail in the book Ending the Depression Cycle, as well as in other sources. Raisin exercise. In this exercise, you are to eat a raisin slowly and mindfully, without judging the experience. This is often the first practice that people try when learning mindfulness. This exercise is described in more detail later, and we encourage you to try it out for yourself. Exercise 9.1. Mindful breathing. There are a number of mindfulness exercises that focus on breathing. An example of a simple mindful breathing exercise is to sit in a comfortable, quiet location and focus on a particular area of the body that is involved in breathing, such as the nostrils or the diaphragm, that is, the muscle located beneath the ribs that is used to fill your lungs with air. In this exercise, you simply focus on your breathing for a period of time. You can start with a brief period, like 5 minutes. With practice, you can gradually increase the period if you choose. People often eventually work up to practicing for 20 to 30 minutes at a time or longer. Body scan exercise. The purpose of the body scan is to become more aware of feelings and sensations in your body. Many people have ambivalent relationships with their bodies. You may like aspects of your body and hate other aspects. You may be frustrated with being overweight, think your nose is too big, hate sweating, or suffer with various aches and pains. The body scan exercise provides an opportunity to be aware of your body without judging. Essentially, this exercise involves focusing on more than 20 parts of your body: toes on the right foot, left thigh, chest, top of head, and so on, one part at a time, while also paying attention to your breathing and maintaining an accepting, non-judging attitude. Exercise 9.1. The raisin exercise. This popular exercise is often used to introduce people to the process of mindfulness. The exercise requires a few raisins, about a half hour of your time, and a quiet place to sit where you are unlikely to be interrupted. If you can't bear to eat raisins, you can use another food, for example, almonds. The goal of this exercise is to eat a raisin mindfully. First, imagine that you have just arrived on Earth from another planet and have never eaten a raisin before. In fact, imagine you don't even know that the object is called a raisin. Next, with an object sitting on a table in front of you, focus your attention on it. What does it look like? Notice the color, size, and texture. Does it have a particular fragrance? What does it smell like? Next, spend a couple of minutes with the object in your hand. What does it feel like? Is it hard or soft? What does the texture feel like on your hand? In all likelihood, you will notice things about the object that you have never noticed before. That is the point of the exercise. Next, press the object against your lips, but don't put it in your mouth just yet. How does the object feel against your lips? Is the scent different than it was when you smelled it earlier from a distance? Do you notice any changes in how you are feeling? Is your mouth watering? Are you anticipating eating the object? Now, place the object in your mouth, but don't chew it just yet. What does the texture feel like in your mouth? Can you still smell the object? What does it taste like? Do you notice more saliva in your mouth than before? Next, slowly begin to chew the object. How does the flavor change? Is it more intense? Is it sweet, sour, or both? As you chew, be aware of your experiences. You will soon feel the urge to swallow the object, but put off swallowing until after you have been chewing for a few minutes. Just be aware of the experience of chewing the object. After you finally swallow the object, pay attention to any sensations in your mouth and throat, as well as any aftertaste. Continue this practice with a few additional raisins. When you are done, take a moment to think about the way you normally eat raisins and how the experience of eating raisins mindfully was different than your usual experience. Record your responses to the following questions in your journal. Do you love raisins and normally eat them by the handful? Do you hate raisins and prefer to avoid them? Do you normally snack on them while watching television or working at your computer? Was the experience of eating raisins mindfully different than your previous experience with raisins? What did you learn about raisins or about yourself through this exercise? Were you able to eat the raisins without judging them or without judging the experience? Was the experience the same with each raisin, or did it change over time? What does eating raisins mindfully have to do with overcoming perfectionism? On the surface, not much. However, exercises like this one can help you to live more in the present moment and encourage you to keep your experiences in perspective rather than getting caught up in the past or focused on future events over which you have little control. Mindfulness can help you feel more grounded, which in turn can help you deal with day-to-day stresses that arise. If this approach is something you would like to learn more about, check out some of the resources recommended in this chapter. Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, ACT. As we reviewed earlier, there are two main components to ACT. The first involves learning to accept your thoughts, feelings, and other experiences rather than fighting them or attempting to control them. The second component involves becoming aware of your own values and starting to make life decisions based on these core values, rather than based on your perfectionism and desire to avoid the negative emotions that result from always trying to be perfect. Accepting your experiences. Mindfulness is one approach to achieving a level of acceptance of the thoughts, feelings, and other experiences that currently contribute to your discomfort and distress. However, there are other approaches as well. ACT teaches people to stop struggling against their negative thoughts and feelings. Rather, the goal is to accept them. In addition to using mindfulness exercises, this approach also uses stories and metaphors to make key points. Consider the following story as an example. What avoiding pain cost the emperor moth? A man found a cocoon of an emperor moth. He took it home so that he could watch the moth come out of the cocoon. On the day, a small opening appeared. He sat and watched the moth for several hours, just watching as the moth struggled to force its body through that little hole. Then it seemed to stop making any progress. It appeared to have gotten as far as it could. It just seemed stuck. Then the man, in his kindness, decided to help the moth. So he took a pair of scissors and snipped off the remaining bit of the cocoon. The moth then emerged easily, but it had a swollen body and small shriveled wings. The man continued to watch. He expected that, at any moment, the wings would enlarge and open out to be able to support the body. Neither happened. The little moth spent the rest of its life crawling around with a swollen body and shriveled wings. It never was able to fly. What the man, in his kindness and haste, didn't understand was this. In order for the moth to fly, it needed to experience the restricting cocoon and the painful struggle as it emerged through the tiny opening. This was a necessary part of a process to force fluid from the body and into the wings so that the moth would be ready for flight once it achieved freedom from the cocoon. Freedom and flight would only come after allowing painful struggle. By depriving the moth of struggle, the man deprived the moth of health. This story makes the point that avoiding discomfort and pain in the short term can lead to problems later on. It teaches us that sometimes a struggle is necessary to move forward. Though you may be inclined to do everything you can to avoid the discomfort you experience when your standards are not met, It's possible that allowing yourself to feel discomfort may be more helpful to you over the long term. However, that is not to say that suffering and discomfort should be your goal. From an acceptance perspective, it can be useful to avoid judging your feelings, such as discomfort, in either a positive direction or negative direction. Acceptance doesn't mean seeing suffering as something noble. Discomfort, in and of itself, is neither a terrible thing to be avoided, nor something necessarily to be sought out. Rather, discomfort and suffering are just experiences that arise as a result of being human, and sometimes avoiding discomfort makes sense. For example, taking an alternate route when traffic is backed up on the highway. The Emperor Moth story is just one example of many different stories and metaphors that are used in ACT to help individuals learn that avoiding discomfort and trying to control one's emotions and thoughts are not always the best option over the long term. Making a commitment to change. The second component of ACT involves thinking about what really matters to you and making a commitment to change your behaviors so they are more consistent with your most deeply held personal values. One strategy for identifying your core values is to think about how you want to be remembered after you're gone. Although it can be uncomfortable to think about, death is something that we will all face eventually. Thinking about how you are likely to be remembered after you die versus how you would like to be remembered can be a useful exercise. There is a good chance that you will discover that at least some of your behaviors are inconsistent with how you want to be remembered or with the values you see as most important in life. Exercise 9.2. Writing your epitaph. This exercise is based on a practice described by Forsyth and Eifert. Your task is to write your own epitaph, the inscription on your gravestone. However, we would like you to write two versions of your epitaph. The first is your perfectionist epitaph, perhaps one that would be written about you if you were to die today. Here is an example of such an epitaph for Tom, a man who always strove to be perfect. Tom's perfectionist epitaph. Here lies Tom, a man who sought perfection at all costs. Tom's goal in life was to do everything as perfectly as possible and to make sure that others also lived up to his high standards. He spent much of his life correcting the behavior of his friends, family, and coworkers. Although his two marriages both ended in painful divorce and his children found him difficult to be around, Tom could take comfort in the fact that he did everything he could to help others think about things in the same way he did. Tom was also very devoted to his job in retail management. He put in many long hours and never settled for anything less than perfection in his work or the work of his staff. He always checked and double-checked everything to make sure there were no errors. For Tom, work always came before vacations, spending time with friends and family, exercising, and eating well. His goal was to make the world a more perfect place, though he left this earth feeling alone and unfulfilled. The second epitaph should be your valued life epitaph, a version that might be written if your perfectionism was no longer a problem and you were living your life according to the core values that are most important to you. Your valued life epitaph should be the one that you would most like to see on your headstone. In your journal, write your perfectionism epitaph, followed by your valued life epitaph. How are they different? Are you currently living your life in a way that is consistent with how you want to be remembered? If not, what must you change in order to live more consistently with your core values? The epitaph practice is just one example of an exercise that can help you to identify your personal values. As you work on changing your perfectionism, notice the ways in which your behaviors are inconsistent with your core values and begin to make changes. If you are working at a job that you hate, why not start looking for a new job this week? If you have been meaning to call an old friend, why not do it today? If it is important to you to become more physically fit, Start eating healthier and exercising regularly. It is helpful to think about values as a process rather than a goal. For example, if you are single and want to be in an intimate relationship, behaving according to your values doesn't mean focusing all of your energy on meeting a new life partner. Rather, it means acting in accordance with your values on a day-to-day basis across situations. For example, you might think about what it is about being in this kind of relationship that is important to you. For example, it may be the opportunity to open up to someone, to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to express love and care, and so on, and make an effort to live according to these values with the people who are in your life now. Even saying hello and smiling at someone else on an elevator might be a step toward beginning to act in accordance with these values. Acceptance and perfectionism. In summary, acceptance-based strategies for perfectionism have two goals. The first is to become more accepting of your own thoughts, feelings, and experiences, as well as becoming more accepting of others. The second is to begin to recognize that although your perfectionism may tell you that things need to be a certain way, there are many situations in which you have a choice about how to behave. You can choose to behave in a way that is consistent with your most deeply held core values, or you can continue to behave like a perfectionist. Now is as good a time as any to start living the life you want to be living.